Neurologist and psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud developed a thought structure to determine the functions of the mind. One such structure is the concept of the id, ego, and superego. The distillation is, the id is desire, passion, and instinct. The ego is the logical thinking self. The superego is the moral consciousness. The interaction is such that the ego acts as a mediator between the desires of the id and the evaluations of the superego, or better stated, what you want to do fights it out with what you should do to determine what makes sense to do. That's the distillation. For more details, keep watching. Sigmund Freud expounded on his 1920 treatise Beyond the Pleasure Principle with a formalized elaboration in 1923 called The Ego and the Id. While Beyond the Pleasure Principle focused on eros and thanatos, the ego and the id focused on the id, the ego, and the superego. Note that here eros is concerned with creativity, harmony, sexual connection, reproduction, and self-preservation. And thanatos is concerned with repetition, aggression, compulsion, destruction, and self-destruction. As an aside, there are undeniable phonemic similarities between thanatos and thanos, as depicted in Marvel's Infinity Gauntlet, as well as their tandem focus on aggression and destruction. Now, this is pure speculation on my part, but it is plausible. In German, the id, ego, and superego respectively correspond to the it, the I, and the over-I. Please notice that the id's translation to it alludes to the sense that it is something outside of the self, something foreign and uncontrollable. This single thought has led me to believe that everyone exists in a constant state of struggle of varying degrees with their id impulse. And it must be understood that given enough stimuli, the id will always win out. The best versions of us can contain, delay, restrain, or blunt the id influence, but it will always be there. And a person must remain vigilant or else suffer capitulation due to banality-induced inattentiveness, the foolishness of arrogance, or simple, some say inevitable, psychic exhaustion. Additionally, from a Roger Sperry-inspired perspective, note how thanatos somewhat aligns to the confabulatory right brain, while eros somewhat aligns to the confabulatory left brain. But remember, Freud's psychic apparatus is not neuroscience. There are no corresponding somatic structures in the brain. This is pure psychology. Freud's final apparatus consisted of the id, ego, and superego. And although now it is somewhat outdated and irrelevant, at least to some analysts, I still find it an excellent model for practical application in understanding and perfecting our daily interactions. It's kind of like how we use the OSI model to explain and troubleshoot computer networks, even though functionally we use the TCP/IP model. Let's take a brief look at the three core aspects. The id. The id is primal. It's pure desire and need fulfillment. The id is amoral and has no concept of and is not bound by good, evil, values, etc. It seeks immediate fulfillment via the pleasure principle. It wants what it wants, and it wants it now, and will do anything to get it. We are born with the id active, and this unconscious biological aspect is dominant from ages 0 to 2. Technique. You cannot reason with the id. The id must be dominated, or it will dominate you. The id focuses on the present, with little concern for the past or the future. It responds to clear, direct, simple stimuli. Have you ever seen a parent attempting to reason with an 18-month-old child? Now, 40, 50, and 60-year-old children who behave like a 2-year-old child, they're also quite common. And that's another story. But I digress. Back to the show. Have you ever seen a parent attempting to reason with an 18-month-old child? They've mistaken the child's conditioned responses for intellectual reason. They then find themselves frustrated, because the child will not listen to reason. Well, they're not listening to reason because they do not have the capacity to reason, at least not in the same way an adult does. And trying to reason with the unreasonable is foolish. The ego. The ego is what we typically think of as the self. It monitors and adapts to reality. It's a controlling mediator between the id and the superego. Intellect, planning, consciousness, perception, all of these are ego constructs. The ego is made manifest between ages 2 and 4. Technique. You can reason with the ego. It uses compromise and delayed gratification to affect safety. However, id bleed may occur. With id bleed, the ego may cloak id impulses with its own, resulting in preconscious rationalization. This means the mechanism for influence is staged before the ego is even active, which essentially allows the beast to hide in plain sight, or be shielded by a cloak of invisibility like in the Harry Potter movies. Use whichever metaphor works best for you. The takeaways here are: a person may not sense the id's presence or influence, and also that one must be ever vigilant by questioning the source of their own ego-driven actions and motivations. The superego. The superego is what we typically think of as our conscience. Idealism, perfection, fantasy, and morals, those are all superego constructs. It's typically made manifest between the ages of 4 and 5. Technique. You can reason with the superego, however, the effectiveness will vary, as its rationalization is not steady state. Personally, I find the superego is the most esoteric of the three by nature. It's also the least trustworthy in data-driven situations, but the most trustworthy in data-starved situations. I would say it's where a person would have a feeling about something or a good or bad vibe about a thing with no concrete way of saying why they feel that way. To wrap up, although this slice of Freudian psychology is seen by some analysts as irrelevant, its impact on the field is undeniable. As a thought model, Freud's concepts of id, ego, and superego can be practical tools for understanding psychological patterns and impulses. There's a lot more to cover with this topic, and I plan to create more content on it. Thanks for watching.